call unto thee, O Lord, and send thou my life to guide us, for we are weak and afraid, and we lack knowledge. There is no one to hear your plea, no one to answer you, no one to ease your suffering. Lord, have mercy upon us.
Hey, welcome to the NY Patriot Show. Here we delve deep into the abyss, covering topics such as occultism, spirituality, secret societies, conspiracies, and the unknown. Join us in trying to put these pieces together and figuring all this shit out. The NY Patriot Show. Hey everyone, what's up? Welcome back to the NY Patriot Show. Today I'm very happy to have back a returning guest. He killed it with his first 4-part series for the Skinwalker, Nimrod, first Skinwalker. Today we have back, and an amazing artist as well. Can't forget that. We have back Robby Marx. Rob, would you like just to say what's up and I guess maybe let people know kind of what your deal is and what you do?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I am Robby Marx. I'm an artist, and I've basically been doing art for the past 35, 40 years professionally. And during that time, I basically go through and research different subject matters. The last thing we talked about was the Nimrod Skinwalker story. And this is one of the other subjects that I've been researching in regard to ancient Bohemia and Prussia, and where a lot of these experimental societal things kind of came from that they're kind of pushing on us now.
Nice. Awesome.
So, yeah,
and if anybody hasn't heard your last series, there's new listeners or whatever, definitely go check that out. It's a 4-part series, and this guy really put a lot of information into that. I mean, the series itself was probably close to 7 hours. So, I mean, my man had a lot of paperwork he had over there reading and going over. Right, so right. I definitely suggest if you have the time to pay attention, go listen to that series.
And, it's crazy because this is something that, I've had this storyline in my head for probably 2 or 3 years, and I just keep kind of digging further and further into it. And last night I sat down to actually, do the timescape and get things in the order so we can talk about them. And basically from about 9:30 last night until 3 a.m, I was getting all the ducks in a row, man. So we could go through this pretty. And, there's certain characters that we have to talk about just to kind of set the scene in this region.
Awesome.
Let's see. So if we go back as far as 800, Charlemagne established what was called the First Reich, or as far as you have these, and it's generally the idea of the power of the country to establish the Volk, or to keep the people's movement alive in regard to their culture. And if we go into Germany and the Rhineland itself, it's the oldest state in Europe, and it actually predated England and France and Hungary and Poland. And what basically happened was, let's see if we go.
I'm glad you're bringing up the First Reich, because I don't think people realize the last one was called the Third Reich. What was
the Third Reich, right?
Yeah, what was the first two? First off.
Right. So that philosophy goes all the way back to Charlemagne in 800. So let's see. And now one of the other factors we have to bring up is the House of Stuart in Scotland, right? And basically, when you look at that whole line, that whole bloodline, you have the whole William the Bruce, who was basically the Highlander in Mel Gibson's movie there. And he's the one that went around and gathered all the Scottish tribes together, to fight. And that line basically comes down to Mary, Queen of Stuart, who there was basically, to keep it short, there was basically a trial that she was in a plot to assassinate the Queen of England.
Oh,
so,
shit.
and she was next up as the Queen of England. So, she had basically, they say she had motive, and nonetheless, they chopped her head off, right? But she had one daughter who they shipped off, and it was Elizabeth was the daughter, and she became the Queen of Bohemia, right? She became the Winter Queen. She only ruled for one season. Before,
Funny, I was gonna say this sounds like some scandalous Game of Thrones shit.
Oh yeah, exactly. It is. Yeah, totally.
You just said winter.
Yeah. So now also, and that was about 1300 that the House of Stuart was established in Scotland. And you figure Scotland was set up by Queen Scota, who was a fleeing Egyptian princess, right? And basically that's where the House of Orange came from in all the bloodlines, right? And in what is it, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, they actually suspect that Queen Scota, I believe it was Holy Blood, Holy Grail, but that Queen Scota was actually Mary Magdalene,
Oh.
So going all the way back to the whole biblical, but nonetheless, so now back into the Rhineland and into Bohemia, right? In 1438, the Habsburg dynasty is basically being established, and
that's a big name, isn't it? I mean, I've heard that before.
Yeah. And well, the thing was, much like Lawrence of Arabia in the book The Seven Pillars, how he goes in and basically sets up the lowest of the Saudi families, and it's the one that they all detested, but then they elevated them to the kingship, and gave them rulership over all the people that once looked down on them. This is very much the same case, where the Habsburg title, as far as them establishing that kingship, was handed down almost as an insult, because the current ruling princes of Saxony and Bavaria, who were the greatest ruling princes of this time, they looked at it as an empty title, right? But the thing was, the Habsburgs were controlled by Rome, very much like Lawrence of Arabia went in and set it up so that the Saudi oil was controlled by the British,
Yeah, I've heard that about the Habsburg before. I've only heard them a little bit about that name, but I have heard the same thing you're saying now, being controlled.
Well, and they were kind of they were really looked down upon, but what they did was they married the kids off into all the families and slowly co-opted those families and brought them into the Habsburg kingdom. So excuse me. So let's see now. So now, and it was around 1517, right? And I'm just going through some of these dates so we can kind of see the background of where we're headed with the story, right?
Awesome.
In 1517 was when Martin Luther basically went and hammered the 72 Theses to the church door, basically expelling the church for selling entryway into heaven. They were so the church, it got to the point with the Catholic Church, right, that they were selling, if you could commit whatever sins you wanted, and you just paid enough to the Vatican, and they would forgive you of all your sins and say that you still maintain the place of heaven. So Luther thought that this was out of hand when they were selling grace, basically. And so he protested against the church, and this is when Lutheranism started, right? And Lutheranism versus Catholicism is a big part of what the story is, because you essentially have the Holy Roman Empire, which is the Roman Church, right? And they're basically ruling as godmen over the Roman Empire, which at the time, is so they say one of the biggest empires on earth. But nonetheless, when you had the rise of Lutheranism, you basically have this splitting away from the crown and the altar, right? So you have this idea, and this is also with Mary Queen of Stuart. When Elizabeth went to Bohemia, you also have the beginning of the rise of the Jacobins, right? And so the Jacobins were basically behind the idea that Mary Queen of Stuart in Scotland had been wronged, and they wanted that bloodline back on the crown of England, right? But it had split, and basically the Stuart line went to Bohemia and married in with Frederick, and at the same time you have this push of Lutheranism breaking away from the church. So you have this rise of essentially questioning the narrative that is going on. Because what you also have at the same time is you have
Where did you mention the Jacobins were from again? You said Scotland?
yeah, so basically when Mary Queen of Stuart had her head chopped off for conspiring to kill the queen, there was like an underground movement of individuals that wanted the Stuart line back on the English crown, right? So that underground thought line became the Jacobins, and they basically, were to overthrow crown and altar and to bring back the Stuart line, over the line that had basically taken over,
I think that's like the same story. I always forget the name of this fucking show, but there was a show, Outlander, I think it might be called. I think that's the name of it.
Yep.
Isn't that like kind of like telling the same story you were just saying right there with him?
Yeah, I mean, the character in that, I watched that with my wife, but the character in that is Jamie, and he's a Jacobin. And he basically has to flee to America, and that's how they end up in their little settlement there on that ridge they're on,
Yeah, yeah. They end up on a boat and then wake up in the United States.
Right, but he was a Jacobin for sure.
Yeah.
And as you see, he's also Scottish. Because
that's why I asked you, because I was like, I think this sounds like that show.
This carrying into and in a lot of ways, I wonder if they're using a lot of the current media and the myth telling that they're doing with television and movies, if they're actually using it to brag about some of the subversion and plotting that they've done in the past.
Yeah, well, you have this show, which I've wondered about that, because I've actually, just through my own research on stuff, I've even come across stuff that went back to that. I don't know if you ever heard of this show called Succession. It might be on HBO. I'm not sure what it's on. I have apps. Everybody's got apps that they're borrowing from other people. Like, sometimes I even put shit on. I don't even know what the fuck I'm putting it on. But I think it's called Succession, and I had Johnny... fuck, I forgot his last name. Holy shit. I had a guest on. Cerrucci, Johnny Cerrucci. And he was going on about something about the Romulus and the Piers family. And I was like, those are characters inside that fucking movie Succession. I was like, one of the sons' name is Romulus, and one of the companies that the father's always trying to take over is the Piers family, the Piers Corporation. I was like, is this like fucking like they're retelling stories from the past?
Well, and it's you gotta wonder, man. You gotta wonder. So now with all the idea of Luther and the split off of the church, right?
And real quick, and I hate to interrupt you, but real quick, for me and for the listeners too, what is the difference with Lutheranism, whatever that is? I mean, I've heard of it, but I couldn't tell you what it is.
Basically, it was. We're gonna get into that right here. So,
sorry,
Luther was actually in Bohemia from 1520 to 1530, right? And in 1522, Luther had gone to Rome and saw what was going on with the Renaissance and just how occulted it had become, and how a lot of the sophistry had begun to invade the church, and basically was bringing in a lot of pagan aspects. And he rejected the Renaissance and went back to Germany, and he basically took the Bible that was in Latin, which was an occulted language, right? Nobody could read Latin. It was a dead language. Only the priests knew the Latin, right? So as far as the mass, and when people would come to church, they would hear the Dominus ex hominis, and but they wouldn't have any clue what they were saying, So basically, it was like occulted almost, where we're the priest class. You come to the service, we forgive you of your sins, you make alms. And that was the whole argument between acts and faith, as far as if doing actual acts on earth would level you up, or if just having faith was enough, right? But nonetheless, Luther took that Latin Bible, right, and translated it into German. So all of a sudden, anybody had, anybody in Germany had access to the literal translation into their own tongue. So now, basically, instead of having to rely on the priest class, they basically relied on their interpretation on a personal level of reading the Bible. And there was actually, what's the name of them? The Ultraquists, who were Protestants, right? And they basically adhered to strict interpretations of the Bible, as well as Thomas Aquinas. So it's like there's all this shifting philosophy, and you have coming up, you have the invention of the printing press, and you have all. So let's see. And what the other thing that the translation of the Bible into the common language did was break down the idea of the divine right of kings, right? So now you have a whole people that don't think that necessarily the head of the Holy Roman Church is handed down from God. And that the idea that he has the right to establish kingships, right? Because all the kings were given their crown and their title through the Holy Roman Church. And basically, if the Pope didn't decree you as a king, then you didn't have any rule, right? So this kind of also fractured that idea. So and
have you heard anything about the Pope trying to get rid of some form of Catholicism or something? I think he's trying to kind of get rid of or something.
Well, I mean, what
Recently.
I see right now is a big push towards like a one world religion, where they're basically saying that Catholicism, Judaism, Muslims, Buddhists, it's like a wagon wheel, and all the spokes go to the center.
Yeah, I have a friend who was in the OTO and he ended up leaving. But now he goes to he was telling me something about some Latin or Greek type of church now. He goes to that instead, and and then he was telling me how the Pope is actually trying to remove that.
Well, now that's when you get into
the
schism. Yeah, well, there was the schism between Eastern Orthodox and the Vatican, basically. So you have that fundamental split where Eastern Orthodox basically looks at the modern, church as a bunch of idol worshipers. So there's a fundamental schism between the East and the West of the Catholic Church as well.
Yeah,
but that's much later.
That's
much later, But now, as a result of this schism and Luther translating the Bible, right? It was in 1540 that we have the founding of the Jesuits in Paris, right? And now the Jesuits, when you get into the Jesuits and you look at Ignatius Loyola, he basically wanted to be like a crusader. And at one point, even he got popped in the streets of Italy, and he had Illuminati material. And so they suspected him of working with the Illuminati, as far as like the Bavarian Illuminati, right? But wasn't until 1776 when we see the Bavarian Illuminati. But nonetheless, Luther had some sort of illuminist manuscripts that he got busted with at one point, right? And Luther, I mean, not Luther, but Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, right? He ended up getting his leg shot out with a cannonball, right? So one of his legs ended up being shorter than the other, which kind of ended his whole career in regard to military campaigns and being a warrior for God, right? So basically, as he's laying in bed and he's contemplating, he was reading a lot, and he ended up reading this Gnostic book about how Jesus was basically looking for the goddess Sophia to basically return her to her divine realm. And there's this underlying Gnostic theme that's in the Bible that's been there for a long time, where there's, you know, the exterior and the interior, but then there's also the Gnostic interpretation, where they view Jesus as coming down, and basically the miscellaneous women in the Bible he's associating with to try to find the Gnostic Sophia to return her. But nonetheless, Ignatius Loyola, he got infatuated with this idea, and basically, as he was meditating in a cave, there was an earthquake, and there was a crack that formed in the cave, and he came up with the idea at that point of establishing the Jesuit order, where instead of, and the Jesuits are the army of God, right? They are the army of the Vatican.
Yeah, I was gonna say the Vatican too. And aren't they also like in charge of studying occultism, kind of, in a sense?
Do. Oh yeah.
Like they're supposed to, like I've even seen on TV. I think they're supposed to, like, they go over old artifacts or like any old stuff. They try to decipher it and figure it out. Right?
Yeah. Well, now the Jesuits, when they were founded, they basically it was more the idea of psychology and psychological warfare, and they were hunting down these Lutherans. And if the Lutherans were coming into the Catholic countries, and because they would come in and they would preach in people's houses and try to convert people, right? And a lot of these houses, they, hearkening back to the Nazis and looking for the Jews, these houses, they would build secret panels, and they would build like secret nooks. And there's a book, what's it called? The Spies of God, or God's Spies. But they talk about how, some of the writings from these Lutherans that were sneaking in, they would have to fit in these, super crooked little areas and stay there for hours, like while the Catholics were searching for, and they would execute them, on the spot. But nonetheless, the Jesuits were in charge of hunting these people down, right? As well as going around, and the Jesuits were actually going out very early on, in the early 1600s, and they were setting up communist communities in Africa and in parts of Greece, and basically running societal experiments where they were trying to, see how a commune or a system of government would work best for the whole, right? So this kind of gets into the whole utopian philosophy and what would come with, who are the, all the miscellaneous utopian writers, from Francis Bacon to, Locke and Hume. And so now it was in 1550 that the France actually sent in military into the Rhineland and Bohemia to defend the Lutherans from being, discriminated against, right? And this is when you start to have the import of a lot of the Huguenots, which were basically they believed in their own interpretation of the Bible, and they were like strict fundamentalists, right? So they were like what became like the Puritans almost. But they came into the Rhineland and into Bavaria, and because they were seen as, so upright and upstanding, they started to gain all these teaching positions and these different positions where they're basically educating children, and they instilled the ideas of, doing a good job, your honor and your duty, like all these things that would begin to build in Prussia what became the Second Reich under the Kaiser, which became, the most unstoppable military force on the planet, which is why Britain wanted to take out Germany at, around World War One, right?
Yeah.
So now, let's see, and it was in 1550 that they divided Germany, because now, see, what had happened was this area, it's kind of landlocked, and you've got the Rhine River running through there, right? And at the top of that, you would have Venice, okay? And all the goods came into Venice as far as a trading port, right? That was, and you have the movement of the banking class of the Phoenicians moving to the Venetians. So you have all the trade in this area of the Rhineland basically built up. They built castles, and it was, well defended, and basically all of the money of Europe was run out of this area, right? Because you had the mass trading in Venice, and everything went down the Rhine, and all the money keepers were in this area. It was like the most prosperous, some of the most highly intellectual people. They were trading literature with France as far as the philosophies of the Enlightenment, right?
Oh, right.
And so you've and what happens in 1562 is in Bohemia, you have the first spark of what would become the overall freedom movement, the push for freedom as a movement for all of mankind, right? And this is the rising up against the philosophy of the church with those Lutherans and those Calvinites and those different classes that were beginning to believe that the Pope wasn't a God man necessarily, and that he didn't have the divine right to make kings, right? So let's see, under Maximilian in Bohemia, he basically said that you're free to practice whatever religion you want here, right? And so you had all the Jews coming in, you had the Lutherans coming in, and you had that's when the Utraquists basically stepped forward. They were the first Protestants. They stepped forth and they openly decreed their beliefs and started practicing with their own church and everything, right? And because of how this area had built up as far as its isolation, and its kind of separation, and and back to ancient Saxony, and back to and you figure the Bohemia itself, right, goes back to a Celtic tribe, which was called the Boii, and right. So by 191, it was a Latin colony, and was mostly filled with Slavic Czech people by 400 to 500, right? And this is also the same area that have you heard of the book The Bohemian Tarot?
Yes, I have heard of that actually.
Yeah, so it's kind of a hard book to come across, but in this Bohemian Tarot, which is written by a character called Pappas, it claims to be the oldest book. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Flip this around. So it claims to be the most ancient book in the world, right? So this book, in that region, within the mystical, societies, basically it entails the manner in which tarot works in regard to Yad He Vahe, as far
Uh,
as right, as far as a cyclical system, right? And so Yad would be the first card,
uh-huh.
and they would be the second card, and Yad He Va, and then Va would be a synthesis of those first two cards, right? And those three cards together give you the final Yad He Va, the final He,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Which is the beginning of the new system. Okay, so basically, it as a construct shows how cosmic energy moves and flows,
Oh yeah,
right?
that would even work with the tarot because like the last Yod Hey Vav Hey, the last one would be Earth, which is like taking the other three and now making it concrete.
Make and bringing it into physical
Yeah,
reality.
yeah, exactly.
Exactly. So, but nonetheless, we're gonna bring up this Bohemian Tarot book later on
Nice.
but I just wanted to, toss that in there just for reference, right? So now we have Maximilian who's allowing the religious freedom, right? But now when Maximilian dies, basically the laws change and there's a religious edict. Um, let's see, that deprives the Bohemians of their religious freedom, right? And now the Bohemians, these are well-educated people that are trying to move away from the rule and authority of the crown and do their own, thing within their own realm. And so this results in the Battle of White Mountain, right? And basically, this was a revolt that the Habsburgs went in and basically put down the Bohemians, right? In the name of the Roman Church. Okay, so basically before, let's see, here we go. Yeah, so it was 21,000 Bohemian soldiers against
Ooh.
23,000 of Ferdinand's Roman troops, right? And basically they didn't kill a lot of people, but it nonetheless collapsed, the movement, and they were able to bring Catholicism, on some level back into that region, until another, and when you get into all these miscellaneous bloodlines and these stories and you start going through them, it's like murders by poison, so and so fell off a cliff, and it's just like at such a rapid rate that it's hard to even keep up with who a lot of these people are, um but nonetheless, that was the first push of essential freedom to fight back against the Holy Roman Emperor in regard to crown and altar, right?
Mm.
And at the same time, you have this underlying Jacobite movement that's agitating, which also has the same philosophy of overthrowing the crown and the altar,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
They're using Bohemia as almost it's the ground where you see the most interrelationship between the Catholic and the Lutheran philosophy and the divide, and that want to establish a break from the church, that schism, right? But nonetheless, that got put down, and the Bohemians basically had to suffer under the rule for quite some time. But then we have, let's see, in 1596, right? This is when basically it was 1567 when Mary Queen of Scots' head was almost chopped off. They almost got all the way through, but they didn't. And the descriptions talk about, once they hit the first time and it didn't go all the way off, like Mary Queen of Scots was trying to talk, and they had to get the second one before her head rolled, right? But in 1596, that was when Mary Queen of Scots' daughter went to Bohemia and became the queen of Bohemia with Frederick V, right? And now Elizabeth, when she went in, she only ruled for one season, right? Before it got super crazy and they had to flee, right? And they ended up fleeing to The Hague, right, in Switzerland, because William, the Prince of Orange, was her protector, right? So now, if we see Prince William as far as of the Orange, right, and we look back to Queen Scota, who established the line of Orange in Scotland, we can see the links between Queen, Elizabeth of Bohemia, and Mary Queen of Scots, as far as the whole Scottish aspect of, uh, William of Orange basically being her protector, because she is a Scottish queen, right? So she goes to the Hague and is protected there, while essentially what happens at this point is the 30-year war kicks off, right? And the 30-year war is kind of something that most people don't talk about a lot, but this was basically the struggle between the princes of the Rhineland and Bohemia and the Palatinate, that were it was basically the struggle between the Lutherans and the Christians, and who was going to rule the area as far as religious philosophy. And some of the generals, some of them went crazy and ended up taking their own power. It's but nonetheless, this struggle of the 30-year war lasted from 1618 to 1648, right, and ended in the Peace of Westphalia, which the Peace of Westphalia ended up lasting 150 years after this, right? But it basically established the rule of the Habsburg and the Bourbon balance of power. And it's interesting also at this time that when they talk about these different burghers and all these different princes, that they speak of them as corporate nobility, right? So they're using corporations at this time to basically run the power of the monarchy as a business, in this region. And let's see, but now the population of Prussia at that point, because of the 30-year war, right, it goes from 2 million down to 700,000. That's how much they went in and decimated, more than 50%, right?
Yeah.
In general, in this area, where all these, Sweden, Pomerania, Bohemia, Brandenburg, like, and all these areas were battling one another, right? And it got to the point where, the mutilations were out of control. They said that the Swedish king, who was the Winter King, he basically rode, and he did worse mutilations and worse torture than they had ever seen of the Saracens of the time, or the Muslims of the time, and the Muslim and Christian crashing, right? So these guys in Sweden were really vicious, as far as, because they were, at one point they were, tribesmen, basically. So you're looking at tribes turning into these regions and turning into these princely areas. And it was in the Rhineland, in Brandenburg, Bohemia, in the German area, where they established what was called the Burgher Society. And these burghers, Burgher, right? They were based, it relates to the idea of a burg, which is a mountain or a slope, right? So these were the shepherds of old, those that took care of and again, like we have in Egypt, we see the shepherds coming in and basically subverting Egypt, and here again, we see the burg, or the burghers, those that dwell on the slopes, that tend to the herding animals. They become, and not only do they take control of the land, but they also start to become the caretakers of the people, right? So wherever that burgher had his land and animals, whoever was on that land, he kind of also took care of them too, right? So, but this was during the time of serfdom, right? So you didn't get paid. You basically had a job and you got fed, and that was, and you had maybe a place to sleep, but
Socialism.
yeah, well, in a lot of ways, yes. And there were societies that, when they took care of their populace well, that they were very prosperous and they did good. But there were other times where, especially when the Roman Empire started coming in and inserting the tax system, and it's funny because if you read the writings of Himmler, right, under Hitler, he talks
Well, are you
about.
saying it's Himmler that wrote it, but Hitler took the credit for it? Is that what you're saying, or
No,
Hitler?
no, no.
Oh, all right. Because I
But
think a lot of shit Hitler was, a lot of that was Himmler. My opinion.
Oh yeah, yeah. But Heinrich Himmler, right? When you read his writings about Bohemia and Prussia, and the Rhine, basically the Rhineland or the Volk as they called it, he talks about the idea that the story of Snow White, is actually about the Roman Empire coming in and crushing Germany, right? And first, Himmler talks about first they brought the girdle, where they basically tightened it up, so they went in and they created the 30-year war and created the famine and basically brought the place back brought it under the rule of the Romans, right? But he says the poison apple, right, was actually when the Romans brought the monetary system in and basically took over the money supply of the region. But back to the whole story. Let's see. And that's where I get into the idea that, like we had talked about, where Germany and Prussia at this time, Prussia specific, or not Prussia, but Bohemia specifically, was used like we're using Ukraine right now in regard to trying to subvert the rising Cold War with Russia, and does that have to do with the banking system? Because Russia had gotten off of the International Monetary Fund and out of the World Bank system and paid off all their loans, and so now they're sitting over there and, after, before it's like we're back at war again with them. So it's just interesting when you follow the money class through all, and it's very much the same here, as far as but nonetheless, that burger system, right, of the burgs and tending of the people, and that's where we get the word bourgeoisie, right, in the Marx writings. So, or like when the kids say now bougie, so basically it was this burger class that was tending to and caring for the people as serfs, that were the first aristocratic or upper class kind of people, right? And that's where Marx and the term of bourgeoisie came from, and again handed down, into modern political vernacular.
Doesn't it seem like any
So-
country that ever wants to like break away from some monetary system that they kind of like got forced into, they always have a problem with
always,
they always have a war with somebody after they do that.
yeah, and the banks fund both sides.
Yeah.
It's let's see. So now, as a result of all this, we still have risings up of miscellaneous dukes, and in 1691, the Duke of Tuscany, he becomes his own Royal Highness, and he crowns his wife queen. In 1692, the Dukes of Sylvain and Lorraine also crown themselves as kings of their region, separate from the Holy Roman Empire. And then it's in 1703 that the Elector of Brandenburg becomes the first king of Prussia, right? But the Prussian kingdom would not be founded for another 100+ years, right? In 1815. So let's see. And it was in 1714 that we have Sophia of Hanover, who's one of Elizabeth's daughter, the Queen of Bohemia that we talked about. She basically, from the Act of 1701, her son becomes George the First, and actually they take back over the English crown at that point,
Jeez.
right? So you do see this whole
Yeah.
line of secession.
Keeping it in the family.
Yeah,
Or in the same circles, really.
right. And he becomes, let's see, George the First, King of Britain and Ireland. Now this is the point where I want to get into James the Bruce. Where did I put it? There it is. Oh, I had to dig this out last night.
Now, is this like the same dude that was in I forgot that movie with Mel Gibson?
That was his great grandfather.
Okay.
Okay.
You knew what I was talking about.
We talked about him initially, right? And he married into the Stuart line. That was Mary Queen of Stuart that had her head chopped off. Daughter gets sent to Bohemia, right? When that line comes back around, now we're in like 1730, right? And James the Bruce, he's like 15 years old when the Jacobites are in full rebellion and doing their thing. And he's born in Lambart, Scotland, right? And he goes to Edinburgh University. He studies law. He comes from an aristocratic family, but nonetheless, he wanted to join the East India Tea Company, right? He wanted to be a merchant in the Opium Wars. He wanted to go get rich off the opium trade that was going on, right? So basically, he applies and they reject him. They're like, you're not material for the East India Tea Trading Company, right? So instead, he becomes a wine merchant, right? So now he's basically with the wine, he's traveling all over, to all these different regions. And as a result, he learns multiple languages, right? He's fluent in Arabic, Spanish, Portuguese, and this language called Ge'ez, right? Which is the language of the Ethiopians. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So now in let's see, 1775. This is the year before the American Revolution. His family finds coal, and he becomes richer, so he starts to travel more. Right. Let's see. He gets shipwrecked in Africa in 1762. And he's looking for the source of the Blue Nile, right, in Egypt, because of all his studies. And basically he wants to find the mystic source of the side that's the life-giving, right? And the other side's the White Nile, which, the Blue Nile has more nutrients in it, so it's better at growing plants and stuff. So he sets out on this journey to find the mouth of the Blue Nile, right? And through the course of going through Ethiopia, he gets taken captive, and he ends up associating, while he's a captive, he ends up associating with the Ethiopian emperor, right? And kind of begins to philosophize with him, and nonetheless, they become friends. And he ends up fighting with the emperor of Ethiopia in some different battles, right? But now when he finally comes back to France in 1773, he brings with him 3 copies of the Book of Enoch. So this is the origin of bringing the Book of Enoch into the vernacular of the conversation, of the dialectic.
Oh, wow. That late?
Yeah. So we're talking 3 years before the American Revolution. Is when this Book of Enoch shows. And the funny thing is, he shows up with, not just 1 or 2, but 3 copies of this book, right? And now this book, the Book of Enoch, is basically an apocryphal Jewish text from 300 to 2 BC, which gives all that precursory information about the angels and the giants and the night journey and all the story of Enoch, basically. Now, when we look at Bruce as a character himself, right? He was a Mason. He was in the Canongate Kilwinning Lodge #2 of Edinburgh. So he was in the second established lodge, and that first established lodge in Edinburgh is at the Castle of Edinburgh, and it has stones, the black stones from the meteor that fell, that some of them ended up in the Kaaba at Mecca. Some of those same black stones are also in the foundation stone of the Castle of Edinburgh, right? Which ties into a lot of the stuff when you start getting into the Masonic orders and the Shriners, and how that ties back into the whole Muslim philosophy and getting into Sufi philosophy, which is a whole nother line of really interesting thought. So now also Bruce, he was 6'4", so he was a tall guy. He had red hair and he was ill-tempered, right? So this is the guy that goes to Ethiopia and brings back the Book of Enoch and introduces it into, and now then, because of that expedition and what he brought back in 1774, he becomes a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And yeah, so that's the story of the Book of Enoch that I wanted to get in there.
I didn't know that shit was, damn,
so recent.
Yeah, for real.
Yeah. So and then
in 3 years prior to the United States,
the American Revolution, kind of like them finding the Dead Sea Scrolls right as they're establishing the state of Israel. 5 days after the founding of the CIA. It's it all gets very, though it's a wicked web, man. That and no matter where you go, it vibrates strangely, So let's see. Okay, so that was Bruce. Now let's see. What are we looking at time-wise here?
Yeah, you can keep going, man. We can go for another 40 minutes if you want. Go to like an hour and a half.
We may be able to wrap it up by then, man.
Okay.
It's let's see. So now in 1751 to 1765, right? We have this character who is called. Have you ever heard of Voltaire?
Yes.
Yes. So Voltaire was considered to be like the godfather of the Enlightenment, right? And he was very anti-church. He was very against crown and altar. He was basically, it got to the point when he was in France that because of some of the things that he wrote, he ended up having to flee out of France, and he ended up over in Bohemia and in Brandenburg and in the Rhineland and the Plantagenet area that we're talking about, as far as Bohemia and Prussia, right? So and this is already after the Empire of Prussia. Let's see. So yeah, it's at the point where we're looking at Frederick the Great is ruling over Prussia, right? And so Voltaire, he basically is taken in by Frederick the Great as a great philosopher, right? Even though he had to flee France because of his sophistry and his rhetoric. So him and Frederick the Great, they're like hanging out, and they're like, and what ends up happening is they start to conspire basically to overthrow the church and the crown. And you can get into the miscellaneous letters between Voltaire and Frederick, and Voltaire is always like, we have to crush the beast, we have to crush the and he's just like all about crushing the Holy Roman Church, right? So at one point he makes a suggestion to Frederick the Great that, well, what if there was a town where it was just all philosophers, and we could write about, utopian philosophy and these ideas, and basically, create the rhetoric to overthrow the crown. And so Frederick the Great's like, oh, that's a great idea. And so he sends Voltaire to Germany, the German area, right? And they establish this little town. And get this little town is a 6 by 6 mile square town. Again, how often do we have to see this shit, man?
Yeah, right.
You
6
know.
by 6.
So Voltaire basically he establishes, well, and let me first, what they did was, Voltaire was the one who wrote the first dictionary, right? Traditionally, the dictionary was a lineage of bloodlines, and kind of like how you see in Game of Thrones, how they would open the book and they'd be like, oh, the Lannister this, and they would, all the achievements and stuff that he, and so that was what the dictionaries were in the beginning, was the lineage of all the bloodlines and how they interacted. But now Voltaire took the term, and what he did instead was he took all the words that were in common vernacular and gave them definitions, right? So by isolating all the words into a single book, when they created this dictionary and published it, and it went out to all the different countries as the highest elevation of the modern philosophy. When a Christian would look up the word religion, it would say a set of myths and beliefs, and basically almost classify it on a very subtle level as something that is not real. You know what I'm saying?
Wow.
So it challenged the idea in the minds of the Christians just by simply taking the words and giving them a definition, right? And we see now how many times have we seen the changing of definitions, and so in Philip K. Dick, he says, if you can control the words that people, if you can control the meanings of words, you can control how people think, basically, right? So nonetheless, Voltaire, after this dictionary, was when he suggested that they have this society of philosophers, right? So they set up this town, and this town basically becomes what is known as the encyclopedists, right? And so Voltaire gets different philosophers that basically agree with the ideas of overthrowing crown and altar, and the idea of bringing forth this illumination or this enlightenment of man, right, based on reason. And now when we get into Voltaire, he was very much a sophist, and the deal was, in his younger days, before he fled France, he actually got thrown in the Bastille for like a year for subversive talk, right? So he knew what it was to be in jail. So basically, and while he was in the Bastille, don't get me wrong, it was the start of some of his greatest writings when he was there, because he had the time to focus. But nonetheless, when he got out, he basically wrote in a manner that it was like double think, where essentially you would say things in a sarcastic. So basically, if he ever got caught and tried in a court of law, the writing was in such a manner that it always complimented the crown while simultaneously making them look foolish. So he had this way, which is basically where we get the idea of sophistry, because one of the things he said, was when you're raising a student, if you talk about the idea, and here we get into Benjamin Franklin putting the idea of happiness into the founding papers, right? But Voltaire, he delighted on this word happiness, and he basically, it was the idea that happiness is the end of all good things, or it's there which in all delight lays, right? So by teaching that to a student, you automatically made them an Epicurean, which is a person who seeks delight and pleasure in life.
Yeah. No, I
Right.
know exactly what you're going with this. Yeah.
So, you know, when you look at,
It's like wordplay just to manipulate people.
yeah.
Fucking
So
wow.
you know, when you look at a lot of these, the way they frame things and the way they present, and it goes into much later Aldous Huxley and getting into MK Ultra and the changing images of man, where basically they took anthropology as a whole and weaponized it. Right. They took the things that drive us, that we see as moral, and use them in such a manner as to subvert our own sensibilities, right? So, nonetheless, Voltaire, in this Society of Insight, and later Voltaire said it was one of the biggest mistakes he ever made, recommending that he didn't think Frederick the Great was going to take him up on it. And he said he wished he wouldn't have had to hang out in the woods that long with all these other writers basically orchestrating this shit, right? So, but what you have is, at the same time, one of these philosophers was Diderot, right? Who basically wrote in a very similar manner as Voltaire. And what they did was they took Diderot and they elevated him through letters in the university system. So basically, they gave him the outward appearance of a well-trained, societally bound philosopher, while Diderot was actually in the woods in Germany writing all this propaganda to overthrow the crown and altar, right? And Diderot, as this was going on, he was also sent out, and he went to The Hague and he met with Elizabeth, the Queen of Bohemia, right? And this was after Frederick, her husband, had died of smallpox, I believe it was. But nonetheless, Diderot meeting Elizabeth at The Hague, they were like exchanging ideas, and like he was teaching her philosophy and teaching her like sacred geometry and like all these different kind of new age kind of things that we see now that people are really into, right? But nonetheless, they kind of had a philosophical love affair, is what they called it. And at the same time, Diderot was also seeing, who was it, Catherine, the Queen of Russia. So, and he's basically trying to encourage them to change society from within. And Catherine, the Queen of Russia, she says, if I followed the ways of Diderot, all my people would be on their head and the country would be broke. So she saw the sophistry. She saw the system that was seeking to subvert the crown, basically, right? And so you have Diderot.
So with this person Diderot, was it like they kind of I mean, I guess it's kind of like what the media does today, but I guess back then their version of it, where did they kind of prop this guy up on a pedestal, so then whatever came out of his mouth was considered like, fucking gold.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, it's what they do now. Fucking, exactly. People in the
so music, again, it's the idea of appeal to authority.
Yeah.
Which is a fallacy, which is a lie, basically. But so now another thing, Diderot and Voltaire, at one point, they traveled to France. And they would go into the different cafes in France, right? And this is when Diderot was releasing his work. And we're going to get into the Halbach here in a second. But Diderot and Voltaire, they would go into the cafes, right? And like Diderot would espouse some great religious, meme. And then Voltaire would be like, oh, but so basically they're running dialectics on people to their face, very much like the news does now.
I was going to say that news and memes is for sure.
Yeah, it's very mimetic. But so what they would do is they would argue the conversation in a manner in which they would increase the philosophy of the Enlightenment, right? And then Voltaire, at a certain point, people not knowing who he was within the peasant class would just bow out, and then people would, so they were on a subtle level inflecting these ideas through society. They were going from different crowns, and basically inflecting these ideas within the royal classes. And then we have the Albert, right? Who is another one of these encyclopedias, and he basically was of the burgher class. He was of the aristocrats, and when he would associate with the royalty, he would be like, we have the best philosophers coming from France, and he'd be like if you need education for your children, he's like, I can supply the philosopher. So they started bringing these philosophers in to the crown and having them educate their children, in this sophistry, in these ideas of Epicureanism, in these liberal philosophies that were being pushed to overthrow the crown and altar, right? So and then it was the Hollenbach who wrote this book called The System of Nature, right? And he basically released this book, and it was a history of the crown and the church, and how they had gone into all these different nations, and how they had overthrown them and subverted them, and like the history of the plunder, so they're increasing Enlightenment philosophy. They're teaching the children of the royals through soft capture. They're exposing the history of the plunder, and how they got their riches. So they're and all this is fomenting, and basically leads to the Enlightenment philosophy revolutions that we have, from the American Revolution to the French Revolution, right on down the line, right? So this is the and we're seeing this this schism of the church, from crown and altar to the Lutheran Calvinists, and all the sophists. And I was just listening to a Harvard professor about the sophists the other day in Greece, and funny enough, he said that they were the traveling salesmen, and that basically, yeah. So again, we have this. They
were the Jehovah's Witnesses of the
wanderer, of the wandering class, that basically comes in, and it's just interesting to see all these patterns and how they cross and overflow. Now, go ahead.
You said earlier too, though, that was also had like more of an occult side to it as well, right?
Yeah. So
I find that interesting.
As far as the occult side, well, okay.
Well, I'm saying, with Luther, I might have been confused with what you said it about. I think I asked you a difference between things, and I thought you said one was a little bit more occulted, right?
Well, some of the offshoots of Lutheranism got into different philosophers, and it was mostly at that time, it was the Catholic Church, the Holy Roman Catholic Church, and the Renaissance that was bringing in the sophistry and the ancient kind of a lot of the philosophy we talked about in the Nimrod series.
Yeah.
They were bringing that into the Catholic Church, so they were bringing the paganism back in the form of Gnosticism, so that it was subvertly hidden in regard to manufacture of sophistry. Right.
Yeah. I think Gnosticism and Catholicism really have a lot kind of like interchange. And I don't know when this happened. I know I had seen it on some kind of timeline show when they were talking about, Christians or Catholics, whatever, being persecuted in the past. They did kind of use a lot of, and now I don't know if this is when the Jesuits were killing them or who knows, but they did use like a lot of symbolism back then to even like kind of like, so each other knows who's who. Like supposedly the Seder Square would go on, they put those on their fucking houses. Or if you're out and like you could draw like part of the fish the one way and the other person would draw the other part, so you both knew. Right. Yeah, so I was just wondering if all that is influenced in any of that. But I don't know the time when that was going on.
Well, and I mean, you had, the various inflections from Ireland and their philosophy. And like in Ireland, basically the doorway was a portal. It was called a Sheila. And so you have a lot of these older philosophies of the Irish, of the Scottish, of the ancient, Saxons, of the kind of all trying to be brought under control by the Roman Empire. And in a lot of ways, people philosophize that was the reason for the rise of Christianity, and creating the moral system that they kind of stole, from the old Egyptian system and all the other pagan systems, and kind of fabricated, whole cloth under, Saul or Peter. But nonetheless, so now here's one of the crazy things though. Voltaire, he said that, in his letters, he said that he had initiates, right? And he talked about the fact that he was initiating these people into a modernized Mithraic mystery system, right? So in this town where the encyclopedists were, he actually ended up building a church, and on the church it says to serve, God. But the thing is, which God are we talking about? So but nonetheless, he at one point even initiated the head of the Jacobin order into his Mithraic mysteries, right? And he said he had also initiated, personally, he had initiated 5 kings, 2 queens, and 4 princesses into this ancient Mithraic mystery system that he was. So here again, we see this ancient, Mithraic philosophy dating back to Persian Zoroastrianism, that's being brought up and propagated and used as a form of sophistry against the crown and altar of the Holy Roman, See at this point, right? And also, after Voltaire had initiated the head of the Jacobins created a ritual in which they had a ceremony where they had the apotheosis of Voltaire, right? So that they basically turned Voltaire into a god or one of the saints of Jacobinism, So, and I think in a lot of ways you can see this Enlightenment philosophy and this Jacobin entailment kind of later down the road proceeding to what would become the Bolsheviks, as far as them going in and overthrowing the crown of Russia. I'm still trying to find that exact point, but nonetheless, tying the Enlightenment and Voltaire to the Jacobins, that was a pretty substantial point when I found out about these Mithraic mysteries that were going on in this encyclopedia town of 6 miles by 6 miles.
Yeah, Magic Square, the sun.
Yeah. Well, and Rome was also 6 miles by 6 miles. Washington, D.C., was what, 60 miles by 60 miles? So they're leveled up.
Yeah.
It's so now
I do have a question. I have somebody asking, yeah. I don't know how to say this probably though. Any connections to Sweden Borgine or
the Borginese?
Maybe. That's what Sweden and then Borgian.
Borgine. That very much sounds like an alteration of the Berg, the Borgine or the no, I haven't really looked into that.
Okay.
Yeah, I did get into the whole early Swedish army system and the general there that basically rewrote a lot of the modern warfare tactics. But yeah, I haven't gotten into that specific subject. So now let's see. And with all that going on, right? It was in 1765 that we have the Habsburg line, and they're marrying into all the different bloodlines in the region, basically taking soft control through, through family lineage.
Yeah.
But the Habsburgs in 1765 aligned themselves with the Reich, and basically for supremacy of the region. They're basically claiming that title at this point, right? And in what, 10, 11 years later, we have the US Revolution, right? And that's the same year we see Adam Weishaupt and the exposition of the Bavarian Illuminati, and that whole order, you know, which we're not. That's a whole
Oh yeah,
subject matter,
yeah, yeah.
man. But it wasn't until May 5th of 1789 that we had the French Revolution basically kick off. And with that, I did find information of the German Illuminists. I found two different sources of German Illuminists and their specific names that had been brought from Germany into France to oversee the lodges, to basically run and facilitate the revolution. And this was also the point at which those agent provocateurs of the French Revolution, they wore the red Phrygian cap, which I think we maybe talked about that briefly in another episode. Did we
Yes,
talk about that?
the cap. Yeah, I think we
You know,
did.
like the Smurf hat, like the red Smurf hat.
Yes, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, so basically in the golden age, during the time of the rule of Saturn, right? They would have everything was milk and honey, and like abundancy flowed, right? And in Rome they would have the Saturnalia, and basically all the slaves would switch place with the rulers for one day, and the slaves would wear the Phrygian hat. And this comes from ancient Chaldee. The origin of the Phrygian hat was in the Chaldee mysteries, and we do see Nimrod at one point in Persia wearing the Phrygian hat as well. But that was related to the Chaldean mysteries, right? Which is very much along these same lines of a later personification of what Voltaire is kind of initiating these kings and queens into. But that red hat during that Saturnalia, all the freed slaves would wear the red hat. So basically, during the time of the French Revolution, that was the symbol of the freed slaves. So those that were freed from the yoke of the church, that symbolically wore that Phrygian hat. But during the French Revolution, they actually wore it so they would know who the other agent provocateurs were, so they wouldn't kill them. And some of the stories as far as the French Revolution, man, I mean, they had a gunpowder concoction that they had mixed up, and they would go around and basically stuff it through a funnel down like homeless people's throats, and it would cause them to go insane and go on killing rampages. There was
Shit.
Oh yeah, all kinds of subvert stuff going on to excite and stimulate the masses into rioting and basically tearing down, the bourgeoisie. Let them eat cake. It's like, but that's the whole thing. And when we talk about revolutions, and specifically this type of revolution, the thing we have to understand in modern times as a modern people, and people that are talking about wanting a revolution now, is revolutions decimate, kill masses, hollow out countries, and leave countries in a situation where they're left to be dominated by the power vacuum. So if there's going to be any kind of a revolution, we have to come to the point where we mentally outthink them and use their system subvertly against them,
yes,
in order to maintain and regain our liberties and our fundamental, inalienable born rights. Whatever you want to attribute that to. We're all sovereigns on the earth. And from a libertarian standpoint, your rights end where my nose begins. As long as what you're doing doesn't hurt me or affect you, right?
I like that.
Yeah. So as long as what you're doing is not hurting me or affecting me in a negative way, physically, then you have the right to do whatever the hell you want. and just this modern push of the World Economic Forum, it literally is a push back to serfdom, and they've done this through history. Like I said, what was it there, when the king died, and they brought back in serfdom. When Frederick, uh, who was it? Let's see. But yeah, when that king died, that basically supplied all that religious freedom. Not only did they take away the religious freedom of that region, but they brought back serfdom. They took away their money. So again, we see this is not a new thing that's going on. It's just the most current push for this type of philosophy.
You were mentioning something before, and I hate to go back, like, kind of off the topic. Well, a little bit. You mentioned the red hats, and that kind of representing kind of like getting away from, I guess, was Catholic control. You know what I'm saying? Or
you're right. Well, as a symbol, they looked at it as being a freed slave from the church.
Yeah.
So as a symbol, they wore the red hat as the symbol of the freed slave.
See, that also makes me think of, like, supposedly, when me and Lux were kind of covering the Shriners a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
You hear about the hat is supposedly red because it's been dipped in, like, the Christians and in the
right.
blood.
Yeah.
So again, like, it's almost kind of going back to, like, even I see kind of a resemblance to that. Well, because that you had to fight for your freedom. The other one, you just got handed for a day.
And that was the thing with you go.
Well, depending on how they're looking at it. I'm not saying they were right for killing whoever.
Oh, yeah.
Just saying
yeah.
That's how they're saying.
War is hell.
Yeah.
But when you go back to the Templars and the fights between the Muslims or the Saracens, that was the case, that they basically took the fez and rolled. So I've read it in a couple places, at least, that they rolled it in the blood, and that was a symbol of maintaining their own sovereignty. So in a way, it does have very much like when you see Che Guevara, and he's got the red beret. That is the French symbol of revolution. So we see that. And then back to Donald Trump.
Oh, that's even like who were those people? The Guardian Angels in New York.
And they wear the red beret.
Oh yeah, and they're fucking real close with Giuliani and Trump.
And they were basically
they've been associated with each other.
If the government can't take care of us, we're taking care of ourselves. Yeah. So they became the liberated, of the new order, basically. Yeah. The red hat is definitely an interesting subject matter. So
yeah, I was even thinking about the red, even the thing you just mentioned now. I was thinking about that too when I was thinking of the Fez hat and the other hat. I was like, I wonder if all those red hats got something like kind of like all a commonality with them.
Yeah. Oh, I think they do. And let's see. One of the things that happened was when this it's called a convulsion in a lot of the different books, as far as these revolutions popping off, right? When the French Revolution happened, the Rhineland and Germany, they got a lot of the benefits, because they had been in relation, as far as, with the French coming in and defending the Lutherans. There'd been a trade in philosophy as far as texts, and, anytime a philosopher would have to flee, they would go into this region. And so a lot of what happened with the French Revolution benefited Germany, as far as giving them certain liberties, right? And in Germany, because they didn't have to work for it and they didn't have to fight for it, it caused like an anti-libertine philosophy to start to arise within the Reich and the Volk and the military sector. So you basically have, and you have those Puritanists that are teaching the children. So they're teaching them loyalty and, all these, and so what begins to happen is you begin to create this mechanistic society that's ruled by the force of the military. in this area, right? Which is why we're having the rise in the future of the Kaiser and the strongest military to that point on the planet, you know. So let's see. Um 30-year war. All right, so this is where we're going to get into Hegel,
Mm.
right? And his name was Carl Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel, right? And because of these Puritans and their position within the teaching system, right? The children that were being brought up had a certain moral philosophy and outlook on society, which a lot of people credit Hegel's philosophy. And he basically writes about moral righteousness, not from the sense of religion, but from the sense of existence. Um, and he's also the one that gets into the idea of dialectics, right? And he propagates, like David
And his
Icke,
name is
how
Hegel.
Hegel, yeah.
Makes me think of haggling. It's like the same thing, going back and forth to get what you want
Sure.
out of the person.
Yeah, yeah. So you know how David Icke has problem reaction solution.
Yes, yeah.
Right? Okay, that's Hegel. That is Hegel's philosophy at its base. Okay, as far as within dialectics,
Uh-huh.
and Hegel taught that you have thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Right. So you again, and now Hegel is in this region where within the philosophical circles, the tarot of the Bohemian is widely circulated, right? And when we get into the tarot of the Bohemian, as far as occult philosophy, um, that is exactly the way that the reading of the cards, or as they say, the energy of Yahweh, Yad He Vahe, works. Whereas you essentially have the Yad and you mix it with the He and you get the Ve. So that's Hegel's dialectics, right? Which is also David Icke's problem reaction solution. And from that solution, you get the final Yad He Vad He. You get the end A, which is the beginning of the new system.
Yeah.
Right? So as far as dialectics and directing energy and how to manipulate systems and looking at Merlin and understanding how the wheels work and introducing slight changes into those systems to so we're talking about the philosophy of manipulation, right? And essentially Hegel gets into the idea that like how you have your own individual spirit and I have my own individual spirit, so also does the city you live in have its own individual spirit, and the town that I live in have its own individual spirit. And not only that, but nations have their own individual spirit. And these are living active entities that basically inflect and move through time to create and propagate, and it's basically the idea of that synthesis, anti-synthesis, that basically brings about the change, so and it was Hegel. Let's see. And basically
I just had someone in the chat saying Hegel is a critical touch point where religion and government became intertwined.
yes, very much so. So and Hegel was at the Jena University from 1800. He was at Heidelberg from 1816, and he was in Berlin from 1818. And he basically is the person behind German idealism, Now in 1816, we have again the rise of the anti-Jewish laws, right? And consistently we see around the world, in all the countries that have Jews, they're consistently persecuted, they're consistently driven out. I mean, going back to Columbus having to leave, where he was, I forgot, but basically the king married a queen and they put an edict down and all the Jews had to be out of the city by sunrise. So that's when he jumped on the boat and left. But we consistently see, just like we consistently see the Jesuits in their social experiments being exiled and thrown out of every country for similar manipulations. The Jewish were being accused of manipulating the money, and there was also, again, back to the French Revolution, and it's commonly associated anytime they're trying to create a revolutionary philosophy. They introduce the idea of the Jews as the money taker being corrupt. They introduce the ideas of blood magic. They introduce the ideas of eating children. They introduce the idea. So, what we're seeing within a lot of the conspiracy culture.
Oh, that's been the accusations that have been going on for thousands of years.
But they are introduced into cultures and societies at points in which they're wishing to facilitate uprise, because they're wanting to get the people into such a state of fervor, But nonetheless, it was in while Hegel was at the University of Berlin in 1818, Karl Marx was born. And he was born in Tyre, Prussia, sorry. And so he's in Prussia, and his family basically ran vineyards. And because of these anti-Jewish laws, his father converted from Herschel Levy to Herschel Marx. I believe it was Herschel, but it was from Levy as the last name to Marx, right? And there's been some different researchers that I've seen that have put together the idea that the Levy line, the Bauer line, and the Rothschild line are all the same family line, that just as they have moved, and it's not necessarily that they're even Jewish. It's more the idea that there's a possible underlying philosophy that uses all cultures to subvert and moves, within them. Because now when you get into like Voltaire during the Enlightenment, he would dress up as a Jansenist with the big hat and put on the Jansenist robes, and he would go to the Jansenist churches and he would talk, and he would, like, one of the things that it was kind of funny, but he would pull people off and get into a discussion with them about occult philosophy, right? And people would come and gather around and start to listen. And when the conversation would really get hot, right, he would step back and he'd be like, but I don't associate with heretics such as this, and da 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 da. And then, basically leaving that person just hanging. And then he would take his pious sophistry and go basically run the same hustle on some other poor innocent dupe, But it was the idea of inflecting these ideas in society, So Marx, as he's growing up, his oldest brother, Moritz, is a disciple of Voltaire. So Marx, was well aware of the writings of Voltaire and the Enlightenment philosophy. And, so he ends up going to college in Bonn, Westphalia. And he is in a poets club at that time that is monitored by the police. And he's from the bourgeoisie, so he is from that class that he basically, criticizes down the road in the Communist Manifesto. But nonetheless, he ends up getting married to Jenny von Westphalen, who is of what they call petty nobility. And she actually already had a engagement, and she was going to marry up socially. But her and Karl Marx fell in love, and she broke off that and actually married down into the bourgeoisie, So, but nonetheless, Marx ends up going to Berlin, the college in Berlin, in 1836. And this is when Marx really gets into Hegel. and he just like engulfs himself in all the writings of Hegel and basically becomes a hardcore follower of Hegel, right? And he's in a group that is called the Young Hegelians. And they're basically radical thinkers that specialize in the idea of dialectics. Um, so
Basically, to like mind fuck people with words, right?
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Because the idea is with Marx being, bathed from his youth in the ideas of the Enlightenment, he basically wants to, and when you look at communism and the Communist Manifesto, he's actually taking the tenets of the church and basically turning them into features of government. So he's basically creating a government that's run exactly like the church, but instead of God being the head of the church, it's the head of whatever, whoever the head of, communism flavor of the month is. Yeah.
It's just changing who's in power. It's not really the system.
Right. And so when you look overall at Marx's works, he's involved in Hegelianism, and he's involved in the ideas of French utopian philosophy, because the Communist Manifesto is a utopian philosophy where essentially once capitalism collapses and the state is running everything in a technotronic manner, where everything's evenly distributed to everyone, then everyone will only have to work a couple hours a day, and then you can go out and spend your free time like painting or looking at books, or so communism is indeed in the end a utopian philosophy. And if we look at the word utopia itself, that means, when you translate it, means nowhere. It's something that can never exist, right? Because nothing perfect can exist on the face of the earth.
Yeah,
because man is corrupted by default, or easily corrupted, I should say. There are some people that maintain piety longer than others. And it was in 1846 that he writes the Communist Manifesto in Brussels, and as Reuters news service has told us, that he was indeed funded by the Rothschilds when he wrote the Communist Manifesto, right? So, and he's still in league with the League of the Just, which was a secret society that he had been involved in for a number of years, which became public with the writing of the Communist Manifesto. And so when we get into, now I want to get into kind of the Prussian, we talked about the schooling system in regard to these Puritans coming in and inflecting the ideas that led to the mechanistic society that became, the Reich of the Kaiser, that became, the fear of the British military. Basically, they thought that the Germans at this point were going to, take over the entire world. So the Kaiser had to be brought down, but nonetheless, one of Marx's key tenets in communism is free school for all, right? And so, and basically, my wife's a public school teacher, and we debate school matters frequently, and the teachers, when you get into the ideas of the schools, the teachers, again, they have the best heart in mind. They're there to try to help the children. There are some that are there for the paycheck and the benefits, don't get me wrong, but anyone that lasts for a period of time, I mean, what does the Bible say? God bless the poor righteous teachers. It's like they're there because they feel they're doing service to society in regard to creating the next generation, right? As far as making the whole stronger, but when you look at the Communist Manifesto and you look at the philosophy of, schooling, and schooling, quote unquote, not education, but schooling, the idea is to homogenize the whole so that everyone thinks in the same manner, right? And
Homogenized whole milk.
yeah, well, you know how they homogenize it, don't you? They spin it so fast that the molecules break up and they can't come back together. So it leaves them all floating in stasis, evenly distributed. So when you look at homogenization, that's what they want. They want to spin us around and leave us all floating in stasis without a full understanding of the whole. And you know, when you get into early American education and you get into the Rockefellers, and them basically coming into the rise of the Protestant movement in early America, they were the ones that interjected the ideas of a good day's work, you know, and so we see this consistently through history of this money class basically creating the conditions for what they're trying to bring about, right? And now in Prussia, back to Prussia, Prussia was the first place that basically standardized education, and they brought all the kids into a schoolhouse, and they basically wanted to separate it from the hands of the church and the hands of the family, because they wanted the children to have a strong attitude about the condition of the government and a national pride, right? Very much how we have American exceptionalism now, right? So basically the 5 key goals of the Prussian education system were obedient workers, obedient soldiers, right? And they had what they called the tall boys of the soldiers, right? And they were, you know, hearkening back to the Anunnaki and the giants in the days of old. They basically had these tall boys that they were clumsy. They weren't good at fighting. They were like, you know, but they would parade them out as symbols of how strong the nation was to encourage the other, you know, and they were the first ones that actually had like modeled after Rome. They had national conscription, where it got to the point where they were having a problem getting mercenary troops. So they basically required that everyone of a certain age basically be conscripted and serve a certain time in the military, right?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So everyone had to serve in the military, much like Israel now. They also had the idea of civil servants that would be subordinated and work for the government. Basically, basically like when we see the press secretary, laying it out, whatever the common meme of the day is, that's how she's gonna stick to her guns. It's like even though I'm lying straight to your face and you can see with your own eyes that what I'm telling you is a lie, I'm going to maintain the idea of the government and what is best for the national pride, right? So they had the civil servants, and they also wanted to create clerks for industry that would work in the same favor for the government, right? And then the last tenet of the Prussian public education system was they wanted citizens that thought alike in regard to national issues, right? So in 1840, we have you ever heard of Horace Mann?
I think so.
Yeah, so he's behind a lot of what became the American education system, right? So Horace Mann, who is the secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education, he basically takes a trip to Prussia and sees how everything's mechanized, and the Prussians were also the first ones that brought the use of the clock into the school system and set up a schedule throughout the day. So basically you show up at 8:00, you have this class. So they're the first ones that created the idea of regimented classes and compartmentalization of subject matter. You know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah, the different classes and shit.
Right. So Horace Mann, he goes over and basically comes back and he just raves about how great the Prussian education system is, and all the things that, and how all the students are so well disciplined and well versed in their subject matter. And so he brings that back and basically introduces the Prussian education system into the United States, and it becomes what we currently have as the current. And granted, it's morphed over time and it's changed, and but nonetheless, it's the overall same, compartmentalized
that's wild.
bell system. That
different classes going from here to there, like a bunch of herded sheep.
But the thing was, they had set it up so that it was the school to military pipeline, where basically you train these students up so that they would become part of the state and the military, right? And that created the powerhouse that became German mechanism, right into Hitler's Third Reich, essentially. But nonetheless, and it was in 1898 that B.F. Skinner, who at Harvard University, basically came up with the Skinner box, which they overlaid over the Prussian model. And that Skinner box is where they basically trained mice inside of a box, that anything that they wanted, they had to appeal to authority. Like if they wanted a treat, they had to hit a button until a person would come feed them. If they wanted a drink, if they wanted any. So basically what that did, that Skinner box from B.F. Skinner, when they incorporated that in with the Prussian, class system, they basically overlaid the idea that in the student's mind, there's always an authority that you must look to determine whether you can go to the bathroom, go to lunch, go to your next class, anything. So in the minds of the individuals that are in this system, when they get out, and the collegiate system also propagates this as well with, block systems, but nonetheless, you get in and your viewpoint becomes always seeking an authority to give you the answer for things on a subtle level. You know what I'm saying? So basically, that's pretty much the storyline, and showing how through the course of the subversion of crown and altar, and the Lutherans, the Calvinists, the Jacobites, how they basically used the dictionary for changing definitions, the encyclopedia to make people think about things in a certain way, the publishing of the plunder and the history to cause people in their minds to want to rise against the system, to the creation of the education system.
Yeah, that blew me away. Even how down to the education system is just like that. That's
right.
Wild.
But also from the government stance, as far as how the ideas of communism were precipitated, and the free schooling was part of that tenet to homogenize the whole, and up to the point that they gave us the internet, I think it was working really well.
Yeah.
And I think now that, because for the most part, they know people don't read. But now that people that do read are able to explore these subject matters and then come on shows like yours and openly talk about them, then what we're doing is, I mean, in a way, we're really facilitating the continuation of that enlightenment,
Yeah.
But
that's wild though. With the school, if you think about it, it's like, did you ever realize everything that fucks us in the ass or screws us over is always handed to us as a convenience? I can see the free schooling for back then was just for parents who didn't want to be inconvenienced with teaching their own kid. Oh, that sounds great.
Right. Well, and then you look at Better Living Through Chemistry and the rise of the TV dinner. And the propagation of all the chemicals in the food, and then they propagate the idea of genetically modifying the food so they can feed more people, even though it arbitrarily contradicts the all the information and one of the things, just to bring it up, it's not even necessarily, well, it kind of ties into all this in regard to historical conspiracy, but did you know Madame Blavatsky when she came to America, she actually married a senator. And it was that senator, while she was married to him, that was in charge of researching and looking into turning sugar into an industry. And basically, so Madame Blavatsky's husband was behind the propagation of sugar into the modern diet.
Wow.
And when you look at all that entails in regard to all poisons are sweet, and just some work slower than others, so if it's just some
that's wild that you just mentioned sugar, because of how much of that can really fuck up a body.
That's what I'm saying, man. So when you got the idea that they want, and government, the word government itself is gubina mente, which is gubina, which means to govern or to steer, and mente is the mind. So and if a government does it correctly, you have a prosperous people, but that's the whole thing. In a way, by talking about this, we're facilitating the exact philosophy of the liberal meme, but more what I'm trying to draw attention to is the struggle between these two, and the sophistry, or those that were the traveling salesmen, that basically created the ideas of mind fucking people with words. You know what I'm saying? And just how, and it's like, I get into that idea of the Mercury, Thoth Hermes Trismegistus, the Trice Great, how that character was handed down, as far as Mercury being the god of the merchants and the thieves and the travelers, and he's got, the staff in one hand with the two snakes that are basically making the snake oil, right? And then in the other,
thought of that. Fuck.
And in the other hand, he holds the bag
snake oil sales, right?
And the other hand, he holds the bag of money, right? And what does he have on his feet? He's got wings to fly. So it's the idea of the hustler.
Yeah,
I mean, Mercury's the god of the hustler, man. And it's they're just all the time, pushing snake oil on us, man, and through sophistry, and
even when you start you get into Mercury, I mean, you start getting into speech and knowledge at that point too, as well. So it's like you're manipulating through wordage, or like we were saying before, definitions, mind fucking people with different ways of saying shit.
And the keepers of the understanding of the speech, and the keepers of that knowledge,
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So
that was badass, man. That was a lot of fucking shit, dude.
I know, right? Last night I was trying to hammer it all out, and I was like, just stick to the key points, man. Because, dude, it's just a swath of so much convoluted information, and this king killing that king, and this prince over, and just
dude, it was totally like Game of Thrones.
Yeah,
it really was.
Right.
What's funny is that I think when I looked at the message when you text me about confirming for the time, it was like 3:00 in the morning too. I was like, yo, this dude's up late.
I crashed about 3:30.
Yeah. Yo, but thank you so much for, that was a whole lot of stuff. I mean, that's what I expected having you on anyway. So thank you, man. That was a solid fucking episode with a lot of shit in it. I really appreciate that.
I just, man, so people can have a semblance of some of the ideas of where some of this stuff comes from.
I say that a lot.
What we're dealing with, and the origin of these philosophies, and how they've been used, and how they work, and how it's been facilitated consistently through time.
I think that's very important. And like I had mentioned it recently, I think this was a while ago. I had said that, I was on a round table with people, and I think they were kind of going off about what's the point of covering such old shit? And I was just like, well, I think that's the problem, is that we don't fully understand our past. So we actually don't understand where the fuck we are in the future.
And those who don't know their past are doomed to repeat it.
Yeah.
So it's like we have to, and when you get into, the Native American idea of Watika, and it's this idea of, the philosophy of the white man consuming all. I mean, the consumer culture, as far as they've created a culture wherein they've taken our historic cultures away from us and homogenized us into this idea of a global, personification, where they're basically trying to now bring back serfdom, through the current communist machination of the World Economic Forum, and I even saw somewhere where the Rothschild and the lines involved with that had also at one point changed their name to Schwab. So it's I mean, so there's a distinct possibility that Marx, Schwab, Rothschilds, the Bowers, according to some people that have traced those lineages back, these are all possibly one bloodline. And I'm a Marx, so I take inherent interest in all this, because, man, I mean, and what really kills me is, I've spent the last, I don't know, at least decade on and off, reading the writings of Marx and Engels, just to kind of have a philological understanding of what that philosophy is. And man, when I hear people talk about what communism is, most of the time they are very far off, especially when you get into a lot of people that believe in social aspects of democracy, and I can agree that certain aspects that we have, as far as like the road system and the fire brigade, which was founded by Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin actually had buckets that had a point on the bottom so that you couldn't set the bucket down and walk away, because once you were involved in it, it was like passing buckets to put out fires.
Yeah.
So I think there's some aspects societally that we need in regard to maintaining the health of the nation. But when you look at Marx's system, capitalism at its extreme collapses into socialism. At its extreme collapses into communism. And it was actually when Lenin took the iron train into Russia, that when he got off the train, he switched the name of the party from the National Socialist Party to the National Communist Party. So there's points, where we can, and in order for a collapse from capitalism into socialism, one of the things that's necessary is for the government to have unlimited spending, to throw as much money in as much direction as fast as possible, to devalue, to deflate.
Sounds like now.
And we got Trump who issued 40% of the currency in 1 year, funding the whole pandemic situation, which however you stand on that,
Yeah.
But and then you have Biden who's in there now, and it's like between, and don't get me wrong, it's not just the current ones. I mean, you have from Reagan and Bush Senior into the Clintons and the drug running and the Bush Jr. and it's a cartel. It's a dynasty basically. It's been coming out of the operations of, from what I can see, the CIA, but nonetheless, they're at the point where between Trump devaluing the currency and Biden, and then you have the Afghanistan debacle, which Assange talks about, the fact that it's just a giant washing machine to transfer wealth. So that was the longest war America had ever been in, and that whole thing was just to move money. And
we're paying for everybody to build back better, except for us.
Yeah. Well, it's like they say, you will own nothing and you will be happy, and you must eat the bugs. But at the same time, they're eating at the French Laundry. They're flying around the world on jets. They're like riding around in their limousines. They're like,
they got beach houses, but they're going on about climate change.
Climate change, right? Obama bought, it was a $4.5 million house right on the water, and they're going on about climate change. So when it's the idea of you shall know them by their fruits, and they are doing the exact opposite of everything that they're preaching. But is it to create the narrative that's required in regard to the theater to precipitate the changing of the minds of men?
Oh, for sure. That's what I think.
Very much like the Shakespearean plays and the Globe Theater. We see consistently, and if you look back at movies and TV, when they're wanting to demonize, the Arabs, you have all these people in, with the turbans. When they're wanting to demonize the Russians during the Cold War, they put out a certain type of product. So it's, and it's very much like bringing back the Top Gun movie, and redoing Top Gun. They're re-elevating the Russian propaganda, to bring back, because, and
that's what I was saying with what's going on with Russia and then monkeypox. I was like, yo, this is like going back to AIDS in the Cold War.
Yeah.
I was like, what the fuck is this?
Yeah. And what did the CDC say? All you need is a Band-Aid, but it's an emergency.
Yeah.
But anyways, man, that's it.
Yo, that was killer, dude. Thank you very much, man. For real. Yeah. For real. So, do you want to let anybody know where they can reach you? I mean, I think I did add already links for you, but I don't think I had you.
Instagram at Robby, Robby Marx, Marx. If you Google R.MarxArtist, I'll pop up. I'm pretty easily Googleable. But I'm on Facebook. And I'll also say this, man. I've got a series of 14 hours of information that I've kind of researched, and it's all like pre-biblical, that I have in the form of MP3s, that I have mastered with music behind it and everything. And if anybody's interested in listening to those, I've sent them out to a couple people and they seem to have really enjoyed them. But if they can find me and get a hold of me, I can send you some links to listen to that stuff if you're interested.
Oh, yo, that's gangster. So, that's awesome, dude.
Yeah.
Nice, man.
But yeah, man.
That's great. So yeah, I'm pretty sure you already put links for you in the bottom. I could be wrong. I can't check now.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure I already did. If not, I will add them. I know I have a bunch of yours that I saved on a notepad.
Yep.
And again, if anybody is listening and you have not heard him do in his Nimrod series, please go back and check that out. Fucking amazing. Just like this one, you killed it, Robby. That's why I had you come back on, bro. I can't stress it enough. Like I really appreciate what you do. You come on, you tell a lot of information and a plethora of crap. That was a lot to take in. People probably had to listen to it 2 or 3 times, but that was a lot of stuff, and I really appreciate that, dude.
Yeah.
For real.
And man, that's just the accumulation. After all these years of researching and digging,
you're like, I gotta have something to show for it.
Well, the thing is, this is just one of the most recent rabbit holes that I've gone down, kind of because of the whole Marx connection.
Yeah. So
I kind of traced that back in regard to how this philosophy rose and came about, and what are we actually battling here?
I think that's a really good point about you. And I meant to mention this before, and then I guess I'll shut up and we'll wrap it up. But even like at times when me and Lux have looked into certain schools or universities, we've come across like how there'll be these universities that seem very Catholic-like. If you go to the page, you see churches and shit, but then yet they stay off for programs to send people over to Germany and Goethe University, which then pushes Marxism. So it's like, how the fuck does this make any sense? And it's like we're kind of talking about that earlier, and I'm still seeing it now when we cover certain things. So there's something up with that shit. But Germany, Goethe, Marxism, definitely.
Yep. The German Illuminists and the Bavarian Illuminati, and it's it's just the most intriguing stuff to really like get into and read.
For sure,
about.
That was really interesting just to hear you cover that and thinking about the other stuff I've seen.
Well, and trying to create a narrative so that semblance of.
Can we see what's really going on?
Forces and and I'm sure in a couple hundred years people will be talking about the United States like this. So
I think you're right, unfortunately. All right, so that is the end of another NY Patriot episode. Thank you, everybody who jumped in the chat. All of you, there was a bunch of you. I'm not going to read all your names out, but you all know who you are. Thank you very much for jumping in. That's why I do the lives. I can't thank Robby enough again. Thank you, Robby, for coming on. And until the next one, everybody be well. Later.